The tent buzzed with noise and tension. Dust swirled in the hot air as Navy SEALs and Marines gathered around a map spread across a folding table. An urgent extraction mission was underway, and everyone was talking until she walked in. A woman in a tan uniform, quiet, calm, carrying a long sniper case. No one recognized her. She set her rifle down without a word, eyes scanning the terrain map. The joke started immediately. "Did command run out of shooters?" one of the SEALs said. Another chuckled. "Maybe she's here to handle comms." She didn't respond. She just peeled back the small strip of tape on her wrist, wind speed notes and distance marks written in fine ink. With practiced hands, she slid open the rifle bolt, checking the chamber, focused completely. Then, softly, she spoke a few coordinates to the radio operator beside her. No one paid attention to the numbers then. But later, those exact coordinates would save hundreds. Silence settled. The laughter died. The room knew she wasn't here to joke. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Sergeant Tessa Hayes didn't talk much. Most people in the unit learned that within a few minutes of meeting her. She spoke only when necessary, moved with purpose, and carried herself with a kind of stillness that didn't fit the chaos around her. 31 years old, U.S. Marine Scout Sniper, now temporarily attached to SEAL Team Orion in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. No one really knew why command sent her. Some assumed it was a paperwork mix-up. Others said she must have known someone high up in the chain. And when she arrived, dust on her boots, rifle case over her shoulder, every head turned. She nodded politely to the team, set her gear down, and started her routine. Cleaning the bolt, checking the scope, adjusting the bipod until it sat just right. Her movements were smooth and deliberate, almost graceful. But there was no warmth in the room. The SEALs didn't make it easy for outsiders, especially not a quiet Marine sniper. At chow that night, the jokes flew freely. "Guess command wanted to make sure our sandwiches were safe," one SEAL said, earning a laugh from the table. Another added, "Babysitter with a rifle, that's a first." Tessa ate in silence. She didn't look up, didn't react. She just listened, counted the rhythm of their laughter, and finished her food. Then she went back to her tent and opened her small notebook, the one she kept for every operation. Inside, neatly written rows of numbers filled each page, humidity levels, distances between ridgelines, sunrise and sunset timings, even the shifting wind patterns that could throw a bullet off by inches. Every detail mattered to her. Every shot depended on it. In the dim light of a single hanging bulb, she adjusted her scope again. The lens caught the reflection of her face, calm, unreadable, a woman who had learned to hide every flicker of doubt. Rumors had followed her here, same as every post before. Some whispered she'd missed a critical shot in Iraq. Others claimed she'd lost her entire team during a rescue op. No one asked her directly, of course. Easier to fill the blanks with gossip than face the quiet truth. But she carried no anger about it. She'd learned long ago that silence had power. Talking wouldn't clear her name. Accuracy would. That night, one of the younger SEALs, Ortiz, stopped by her workspace. "Mom, Sergeant," he said awkwardly, peering over her shoulder. "How long you been on the rifle?" She didn't look up. Long enough to know wind lies more than people do. He blinked, unsure if she was joking. She wasn't. Her call sign, Lockjaw, fit her perfectly. She earned it years ago during sniper school for her ability to stay completely still under pressure, jaw clenched, breathing controlled even through long hours of waiting. Once, during a week-long Overwatch mission, her spotter swore she didn't move for 12 straight hours. When she did speak, her words were clipped but precise. She had a dry, quiet sense of humor, the kind that made you think she was always 2 steps ahead. Her mentor, Gunnery Sergeant Holt, used to tell her, "The best snipers don't brag, Tessa. They breathe once and change history." She remembered that every time her finger touched a trigger, Holt had been more than a mentor. He'd been the voice that steadied her when everything went sideways. Flashback, Tessa and Holt in the desert years ago, lying prone behind a rifle as the sun burned the horizon. Holt had chuckled. "One day, you'll take a shot that changes everything. But don't chase it, let it come." She never forgot that. And in Helmand, as the sun dipped low and the call to evening prayer echoed from the nearby village, those words came back to her like a whisper. Days passed. The tension didn't fade. Every mission briefing, she stood at the back of the tent, quietly marking maps and noting escape routes while the others traded jokes and stories. When she offered tactical input, once suggesting a higher overwatch position to counter expected ambush fire, the SEAL commander waved it off. "Appreciate it, Sergeant, but we've got our own system." She nodded, no protest. But later that night, she climbed that ridge anyway, just to confirm her instincts. From that height, she saw exactly what she predicted, a choke point perfect for an ambush. She didn't mention it again, she just logged the coordinates in her notebook. It wasn't pride, it was preparation. She'd seen what happened when arrogance went unchecked on the battlefield. In quieter moments, when the base generator hummed and the air cooled, she'd clean her rifle again, methodical, almost meditative. She treated the weapon not as a tool but as a partner. Her hands moved across the metal with care, checking the barrel, adjusting the trigger pull by feel alone. One night, Ortiz walked by again and muttered, "You clean that thing more than you sleep." She replied without looking up, "It doesn't jam on me, and I don't jam on it." He laughed awkwardly and left, but there was no arrogance in her voice, just fact. What no one knew, what she never said, was that behind her calm was a storm she carried from Ghazni, a mission gone wrong that left more ghosts than medals. She'd watched friends fall, radio silent, and stayed behind to cover the last evac bird out. No one had ever written her name in the reports. She didn't care. Those men had gone home. That was what mattered. Here, now, the mission would test her again. Different valley, same heat, same dust, same doubt in other people's eyes. She folded her hands behind her back, staring across the camp at the SEALs, laughing by the fire. She didn't blame them. They didn't know her story. They didn't have to. Tomorrow, the extraction would begin. And when the storm came, when bullets started flying and voices screamed over the radio, they would finally see what a quiet Marine sniper could do when it mattered most. Tessa closed her notebook, slid it into her pack, and whispered Holt's words to herself one more time. Breathe once. Change history. The morning started quiet, too quiet for Helmand Province. The air was sharp, dry, and heavy with that uneasy calm soldiers recognize before the world explodes. The convoy had rolled out at dawn, a long line of armored Humvees and tactical trucks carrying SEAL Team Orion and attached Marines toward a remote wadi where local intel had flagged enemy movement. From her perch on a ridgeline 2 clicks away, Sergeant Tessa Lockjaw Hayes watched it unfold through the scope of her M40A6. She lay flat against the baked earth, rifle steady on a rock rest, spotting scope beside her, dust caked to her uniform. The view from up here was almost peaceful, until the first explosion tore through the silence. A massive plume of black smoke erupted from the convoy's center. The radio came alive at once. Contact left. Contact right. We're pinned down. Voices overlapped, calm turning to panic, panic turning to chaos. She could see muzzle flashes in the valley, the shimmer of heat distorting the chaos below. The SEAL unit was surrounded, 220 operators caught in a perfect U-shaped ambush. Hundreds of Taliban fighters closed in from the surrounding ridges, cutting off escape. Hayes stayed motionless, her eyes locked to the scope. Her spotter, Lieutenant Reiner, cursed under his breath and tried to reach command. Overwatch 1, requesting permission to engage. Repeat, requesting clearance for sniper support. Do we have green light? The radio crackled. No response. Then, static. Command's voice came through faintly, fragmented. Negative engagement until confirmation, civilian presence in the AO. Hayes's heartbeat slowed, not sped up. Years of training taking over. Her pencil moved across the notebook at her elbow. Wind direction, 8 miles southwest, humidity 14%, range 2,300 meters. She glanced at Reiner. They're too exposed. They won't last 20 minutes. Reiner hesitated. Orders are clear. No fire until command says go. Down below, the SEALs were pinned in that narrow, dry riverbed. Nowhere to move, nowhere to retreat. Bullets sparked against rock and armor. Through her scope, she saw two men drag a wounded operator behind a vehicle already burning. A voice broke through the comms. Raw, urgent. This is Alpha 2. We're losing people. Overwatch, where the hell are you? Tessa clenched her jaw. Every instinct screamed to act. The captain beside her, a man named Foster, leaned back in his folding chair, radio still crackling on his lap. He'd been assigned to oversee the Overwatch detail, a man who didn't like taking input from a sniper, much less a female Marine. Relax, Hayes, he said with a smirk. You wouldn't make that shot even if you could. She said nothing. Just adjusted her scope half a degree, noting how the wind kicked up dust between her and the wadi. Sand stung her cheek, but she didn't blink. Below, the scene worsened. The SEALs were trying to form a perimeter, firing in bursts. Smoke from RPGs and burning vehicles turned the air thick and gray. Through it, she saw movement, dozens of enemy fighters pouring down the slopes. Her radio filled again with shouts. We're pinned! We need Overwatch! Any eyes, any guns? Reiner's voice trembled. Command says, we wait. They think civilians might be in the area, Hayes whispered mostly to herself. They'll all be dead before that's confirmed. She lined up her scope again. Through the magnification, she could see one Taliban spotter with binoculars giving range calls for a mortar team setting up on the far ridge. The rangefinder in her head did the math automatically. 3,000 meters, give or take. Too far for a clean shot by the book. But maybe not by her book. Foster leaned closer, chewing gum lazily. I know that look, Hayes. Don't go cowboy on me. You pull that trigger without commands go, and you're done. Understand? She didn't look at him. She watched the mortar crew lift the tube upright, watched the angle shift. Her heart didn't race. It slowed. That strange, razor-sharp focus that comes when a sniper's world narrows to one breath, one moment, one trigger pull. Her finger brushed the trigger guard. Not yet. The first mortar fired. The round arced beautifully, horrifyingly, across the sky and dropped dead center into the SEAL position. The blast rocked the valley. Foster cursed, grabbing the radio. Command, this is Overwatch 1. We're losing them down there. Request immediate. Another explosion cut him off. Hayes's knuckles whitened around the rifle. Her mind screamed, take the shot. Her training screamed, wait for clearance. This was the sniper's curse. To see what others couldn't, to hold still while people died, to follow orders even when instinct begged otherwise. Jesus, Reiner whispered. They're dropping like flies. Hayes didn't respond. Her eyes locked on that mortar team again. They were reloading. Calm. Efficient. Professionals. She adjusted her elevation. 1 click. 2. Calculating wind drift. Reiner noticed and shook his head. Tessa, don't. They'll hang you for it. Another blast hit the convoy. The radio erupted. We need Overwatch now. Anyone, for God's sake. Then silence. The kind of silence that feels like the air itself holding its breath. She stared through the glass, seeing one SEAL trying to pull another wounded man to cover, his hand slipping on blood. Her lips parted slightly. Wind, 7.5 west. Drop 12.3 mils. Reiner looked at her. You're not seriously? Range confirmed, she said quietly. You don't even have clearance. They don't have time. Foster stood up sharply. Sergeant Hayes, step away from that rifle or... She didn't hear him anymore. She didn't hear anything. The world around her narrowed until there was only the scope, the target, and the rhythm of her breathing. Sight, out. Though, in, out. She steadied her elbow in the dirt, shoulder tight, cheek pressed to stock. Her heartbeat slowed until it barely registered. She'd done this 100 times, but never with this many lives depending on it. She whispered the words her mentor once said to her, "Breathe once, change history." The crosshairs hovered over the enemy spotter. He was calling out new coordinates, finger raised to count down the next fire. One breath. One heartbeat. Then Foster shouted, "Stand down, Marine!" "That's an order." But she didn't move. Her finger brushed the trigger, pressure building. Then she stopped. She exhaled and lifted her head slightly. Not yet. The line between duty and instinct hung like a tripwire. She watched the SEALs reposition. Wounded dragged to the rear, ammo belts emptying fast. One man tried to climb the ridge for better cover and was hit immediately. Tessa's nails dug into the rifle stock. Her eyes burned, not from emotion but from the dust, the smoke, the weight of choice pressing on her chest. Foster turned away, yelling into the radio. "Command, I repeat, do we have clearance to fire?" A long pause. Static. Then, faintly, negative. "Do not engage until confirmed non-combatant status." Foster threw his headset down in disgust. "They're gonna die waiting for paperwork." She glanced up from her scope. "Then we shouldn't wait." He glared at her. "That's not your call." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was distant gunfire echoing off the cliffs. She went back to her scope. The mortar crew was adjusting again, preparing to drop another round. This one would land directly on the SEAL command post. She bit her lip. Her finger hovered again. Every second felt like a lifetime. Inside her headset, one final desperate voice broke through. "They've got us surrounded." "Any overwatch, please. Anyone." Hayes's eyes hardened. Her breath steadied. Reiner saw it in her expression and whispered, almost pleading, "Tessa, don't throw your career away." She didn't answer. She blinked once, slow, and whispered back, "Careers can be rebuilt. Dead men can't." The desert wind picked up, whipping dust across her face. Somewhere far below, 220 SEALs were trapped in that wadi, praying someone, somewhere, would see them. Up on that ridge, one Marine sniper had them in her sights. And the question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. If you were in her place, watching 220 men trapped, would you have waited for permission? Between the blasts and radio screams, small, ordinary moments revealed more than anyone expected. Tessa wiped grit from her wrist one evening, and a faded black hawk feather showed through the cuff of her sleeve. It looked like an old promise, ink-worn soft by years of sun and sweat. People who noticed glanced away quickly, not sure why the feather mattered. To Tessa it was private, a marker of a past she didn't announce. She didn't pull her sleeve down, she just kept working. A thin white scar sat just above her right eyebrow, a pale line that caught the light when she tilted her head to check wind. It wasn't new. It spoke of a close call, a sliver of metal, or a rock that had once rewritten the map of her face. When she cleaned her scope, her fingers paused over that spot as if remembering a name. At the edge of her kit, folded and tucked into a pocket like something too sacred to air openly, was a patch. On a slow night, she let her hand brush it. Black cloth, stitched letters, Raven Company. She never talked about Raven Company. She never had to. The patch did the talking when it needed to. A young SEAL named Mercer caught sight of the patch one afternoon while helping pass ammo. He frowned, holding the fabric carefully like it might break. "Wait," he muttered, more to himself than to her, "that's from Ghazni." Raven Company fought there. Thought none of them made it out. Tessa simply continued loading magazines, slow and steady. She didn't look up. No one pushed it. In the unit, questions had a cost. Answers could reopen old wounds. The silence settled like dust. Wordless competence leaked out in small ways. Once, the armorer walked over to check her rifle after a long day. He expected a quick glance and a cursory thumbs up. Instead, he watched her strip the weapon with the kind of hands that had done it the same way 1,000 times. She disassembled the barrel, careful with the springs and pins, laying each part in a perfect line on the cloth. The armorer stopped mid-sentence, screwdriver in hand, and let the noise of the workshop ebb. Others in the room noticed the pause and leaned in without meaning to. Precision like that drew respect even from people who were quick to mock. "Where'd you learn to do that?" someone asked, trying to sound casual. The armorer only shrugged, eyes on her hands. No one remembered the last time they'd seen a service weapon handled so exactly. The chatter died down. Whispers began in the corners where jokes used to be. Night brought quieter probes into who Tessa had been. A stray photo fell from the lip of her kit once. A picture creased at the edges, sun faded, showing a group in desert fatigues with faces pressed close. A Raven Company patch was stitched on a sleeve in that photograph. Her hand closed over it before anyone else could ask. On patrol briefings, she kept to the back, but small things made others look twice. How she read the wind with a tilt of her head. How she measured angles on a slope as if it were a page she could read by touch. Little gestures that, taken together, suggested a history no one had expected. Then the comms day turned strange. Mid-morning, while the base hummed with routine, an encrypted burst came through on a channel that had been silent for years. The voice was clipped, a military cadence wrapped in static. "Lockjaw, confirm position." The name hung in the air like a thrown stone. People stopped, and the tent seemed to narrow. Commanders checked their heads-up displays, looking for the tag that shouldn't be there. Radios and hands grew heavier with the weight of recognition. Lockjaw was a call sign from stories in the old files, the kind that older veterans mentioned with a cigarette and a sigh. It had been whispered with reverence and the bitter taste of loss. No one expected to hear it again. No one expected it to be called in this valley. Heads turned toward Tessa, as if the air itself pointed. Her rifle rested across her knees. For a moment she didn't move. The wind pressed dust against the tent flaps and all the unrelated noise chatter, cups clinking, boots shifting, dropped away. Faces around her went pale. Reiner, her spotter, tapped her shoulder lightly, barely a question. Her fingers closed around the stock of the rifle with the same ease she used to hold a pen. She answered the call sign the way a person answers an old friend on the phone comm, with no show. "Lockjaw here," she said into her headset, voice steady but soft. A hush stretched like a blanket. The man who sent the call was a voice from the previous decade, a senior operator who had once been on Ghazni rotations. He sounded stunned, almost afraid to believe his ears. "Confirm your coordinates and status." Tessa read off numbers cleanly, the kind of crisp, clinical tones that commanders liked on the other end of a radio. Nothing more, nothing less. Her words were a map. On the other end, there was a long pause, the kind of pause that tastes like recognition and apology at once. Around the tent, whispers multiplied. Memories unspooled in the minds of older operators, stories of an operation that had fractured into rumor, of men who had vanished into dust and radio silence. Raven Company had a reputation written with both courage and heartbreak. Mentioning it made people remember names they had tried to forget. When the call ended, the senior operator's voice was steadier but held an odd weight. "Good to hear you, Lockjaw. Hold tight." No medals were presented in that instant. No parade started, only the subtle shifting of a unit's understanding. People stood a fraction straighter. The jokes that had filled the tent the week before felt thin and small now. In the days that followed, small acts kept pulling the curtain back slightly. How she checked the bolt with the same rhythm every time, how she always carried an extra water bladder for someone else, how she kept a tiny compass tucked in her watchband. Each small detail fed the new pattern forming in other people's heads. Still, she never volunteered the story. She didn't tell them what had happened in Ghazni, or how dogs had gone quiet, or how it felt to count the people you couldn't bring home. She let the patch and the scar and the tattoo and the way she handled a rifle do the speaking. That silence was deliberate, a guarded thing. People learned to respect it. A quiet weight settled over the Overwatch team. Where there had been open ridicule, now there was something like reverence. Not because she demanded it, but because the past had a way of demanding it for her. Night after night, under a sky splattered with stars, someone would catch Tessa staring out toward the valley she'd once known. Not pity, not curiosity, just a slow, steady understanding. The kind that doesn't need words to be true. The crack of a round cut the air like a judge's gavel. It came from nowhere and everywhere, a clean, small report that stole the breath from the valley. Tessa felt it in her bones before the radio even caught it. Her spotter, Lieutenant Reiner, who had been scanning the opposite slope, suddenly jerked, arms whipping out to his face. He slumped forward. The wind knocked from him, and the world narrowed to the sight of blood blooming dark on desert cloth. "Reiner," she breathed into the headset, hands already moving. He hit the dirt hard. The radio in his pack skittered and fell, antenna kinked. His mouth opened and closed, no words coming. Tessa crawled to him before she thought. She pressed a hand to the wound, felt heat and the taste of metal in the air. The sterile, practiced movements of first aid felt clumsy with adrenaline. Her fingers found the pulse at his wrist, weak, thready. He was conscious but fading. "Medic!" someone shouted below, and then another voice, "We need a medevac!" The valley was a chorus of panic, of shouted coordinates and the metallic rattle of gunfire. The SEALs below were trying to keep a line, still moving, still fighting, but their form was breaking under the weight of casualties. Tessa's headset was a mess of static and cries. Reiner squeezed her hand, eyes glassy. "There's a shooter on the ridge," he managed, voice thin. He pointed, finger trembling. Tessa followed the line of his hand. On a far cliff, almost a silhouette against the sky, a figure ducked behind rock, re-emerged, shouldered a rifle, and adjusted a scope. A trained marksman, watching, counting, waiting. The angle told her that man had a shot on the SEAL commander if he shifted to the left of the convoy. He'd been lining up for it. She swallowed. The captain, 2 tenths over, was on his feet, face red under the brim of his cap. No fire. No engagement. "Not until command confirms non-combatant status," he yelled into the radio. The order felt like a chain around her wrists. Foster stood like a wall between orders and action, but his voice trembled. Reiner's breaths came shallow. "We don't have relay if I go down," he said, eyes on her, fierce and pleading. "If you fire, they'll hang you." Tessa looked at him, really looked. Reiner had been her rock these past days, a kid with a dry wit and steady hands, a man who had trusted her with his life. She thought about the men 2,000 feet below their position, the way the mortar rounds had split men in half. She thought about the wounded being dragged, about the way the smoke swallowed sound and made the world small and sharp. She thought about Holt's voice in her head. "Breathe once, change history." Her training screamed consequences. A court-martial for disobeying a direct order. Her family name and future on a line. The rules that bind soldiers are not romantic. They are literal chains meant to prevent chaos and protect civilians. But the faces below were not abstractions. They were people she'd know if she closed her eyes long enough. A man below, someone shouting into the radio with the rough calm of a unit leader, barked, "We're losing men. Overwatch if you have anything, engage." "For God's sake!" His voice snapped into static. For an instant the audio cut, and in that gap the world seemed to lean toward choice. Tessa crawled back to her position. Reiner's hand tightened once in hers and then drifted slack. She laid him down gently, tore open a bandage, pressed on the wound in a practiced motion. It was enough to stave off shock, but not to stop the bleeding. She made her calculations in her head, as if this was just another part of her weapon. Wind 7.2 meters per second, range 3,200 meters to the far cliff, crosswind making for a right-to-left drift, temperature, humidity, every variable becoming a small, manageable enemy. She set the rifle's bipod into the rocky ground with an almost tender precision. There was a thin, cold line of fear in her gut, but the rest of her senses sharpened. The scope became a telescope into someone else's life, a man adjusting a scope, the glint from a lens, the flash of a sleeve. She could see the reckonings, the way he set his feet, the way he tucked his cheek to the stock. He was a good shooter. Professional. If Tessa missed, if she miscalculated, the consequence was not just a failed shot. It was the widening of a death toll. Foster's voice boomed again, frantic now. "Stand down, Hayes. You will not engage without command's clearance." His words were an order, written in the code every soldier felt. Chain of command, obedience, discipline. He was older than she was, and the uniform sat on him like armor of certainty. Tessa could have obeyed. She could have watched men die to keep her record clean. That thought moved through her like ice. Instead, a memory from Ghazni rose without invitation. The night the bridge burned and the orders to fall back were given, and how she had watched friends go and had waited too long for permission that never arrived. She closed her eyes for a blink, then opened them to the scope's magnified world. She thought of Reiner's pulse under her fingers, fluttering, fragile. Careers can be rebuilt, she had told him once. Dead men cannot, she whispered, so only the rifle could hear it. If I don't, they die. The sound was small and terrible in its certainty. Her finger found the trigger, not with drama, not with a cinematic swell, but with the measured calm of someone who had practiced this exact motion so many times, her body did not need permission. She remembered Holt's guiding cadence breath, settle, focus. She breathed out slowly, filled the chest, let it empty. The desert air seemed to hold for that instant, as if the planet itself waited. Then she squeezed. The shot left the barrel with a thin crack. For a fraction of a second she felt nothing but the rifle's recoil biting into her shoulder. Then, the world elongated. The tiny sliver of visible flight stretched in her mind's eye, because at this distance, the bullet's journey was long enough to feel like another heartbeat. The wind pushed at the round, the air smearing it slightly, but the calculation was true. Her training had accounted for drift, for Coriolis, for mirage. It was a math of death she had practiced in lonely nights and lonely ranges. The enemy sniper's head snapped. He staggered, then folded like a cut rope. The cliff took him first, his rifle slid from his hands and tumbled down the rocks. The echo of that impact rolled through the valley like thunder, a low, answering drum that seemed to wake people out of a fog. For a full 10 seconds, nothing moved. The world on the other end of the comms froze. Then a voice came, raw and incredulous from the middle of the chaos. Target down. Sniper neutralized. Who the hell just saved us? The words crawled through static, met with a chorus of whispered confirmations, then a stunned silence where jokes used to be. Foster's face had gone white. Men looked at Tessa as if the air itself had printed her name on their minds. Reiner, pale, biting his lip, managed a laugh that was half sob and half relief. You, he said, voice breaking, you shot him. She couldn't give anything like pride. Her hand shook as she rechecked the bolt. Reiner pressed a rag into the wound and tried to sit up. You idiot, he murmured, grinning despite himself. You absolute idiot. Around the camp, commanders clambered to get eyes on the far ridge. A chatter erupted. Calls, acknowledgments, disbelief. Someone swore softly, then louder. Who authorized that? Who is that shooter? The comms were alive now with a new sound, gratitude tangled with fury. Down in the wadi, a SEAL's voice came through, raw with confusion and gratitude. Overwatch, this is Orion Command, who just took the shot on the far ridge. You saved my men. Identify yourself. There was a pause, heavy and expectant. Tessa kept her face down, fingers moving with calm efficiency, checking her reticle, breathing in. She could feel the heat of what she'd done, legal consequences, the weight of orders flouted, the clean, ugly necessity of a life saved. The radio clicked again. Someone barked a name she recognized. Commander Jacob Raines's voice, steady and authoritative, came faint through the static. He'd been whispered in the older files, a man who'd fought in Ghazni, the one who had once worked alongside Raven Company. Report. Who fired? Raines demanded, her throat tightened. The tent seemed too small. For a moment she almost wished for heat, for smoke, for anything to justify the action without words. Then she answered simply, keeping her voice level because voices mattered in chaos. Lockjaw. Overwatch. Target neutralized. Reiner wounded, request medevac. The feed went silent for half a breath. Then, muted, Raines said, stand by. Hold position. He added nothing about paperwork, nothing about retribution. There was only the mechanistic human response when a life is saved, relief edged with the recognition of competence. Whispers spread through the ranks like a sudden wind. Mercer, The young SEAL who'd first noticed the raven patch stared at her with new eyes. "Lockjaw?" he mouthed, as if tasting an old story. Foster finally found his voice, but his anger had turned brittle. He barked into the radio at command. A report, an explanation laced with fury and the tremor of fear. She engaged without clearance. "She saved them. His sentence broke under the weight of both facts. Men came up the ridgeline, boots eating rock, faces open and raw as they tried to understand. Down below, the SEAL commander's voice returned, steadier now, tempered by the shock of survival. "Overwatch Lockjaw, whatever your clearance, you're alive with us. We owe you everything. We will sort the rest later." Tessa let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Reiner's grip squeezed hers, a silent thank you. Around them, the tent unfurled like a stage where everything both smaller and larger than life had played out orders, loyalties, the brittle architecture of military protocol bending in the face of a single, clear human choice. Later, men would argue about the legality of her action. Papers would be written and read, and men in offices far from sand and smoke might shake their heads and call it insubordination. But in the valley that day, where men crawled from burning trucks and bodies were counted and mourned and blessed in the same breath, there was another reality. 220 men were alive because a quiet Marine took a single, impossible shot. As the medevac helicopter thumped in, sunlight catching on its rotors, the noise of the valley swelled into a strange, ragged harmony, shouts of pain and relief woven together. Reiner's eyes found hers again, and he managed to grin, a mess of dust and blood. "Breathe once," he rasped, "then chain smoke and curse Holt for making you so stubborn." She let herself crack a small smile, the kind that meant nothing and everything. The ripple of whispers became a murmur of respect. People stepped closer, not to congratulate, but to touch the fact they were spared. The world continued to spin, bureaucratic storms gathering on some distant horizon. Right then, there was only the smell of diesel and sulfur, the hum of the medevac, and the thud of boots reclaiming the ridge. Someone below said, almost reverently, "Who is Lockjaw?" And the valley gave an answer, not with paperwork, but with the simple, human sound that follows a miracle, a chorus of names, thanks, curses, prayers, and the beginning of a story that would not stop being told. The base felt different when the helicopters came back. The rotors pushed hot air across the landing strip, lifting dust and the stale smell of fuel. Men who had left looking hard and sure came home with faces drained and eyes too wide. Some limped. Some leaned on someone else's shoulder. A few looked up at the sky like they still couldn't believe they were seeing it again. Tessa stood off to the side near the edge of the hangar, rifle case open on a workbench. The sun threw long slats of light through the corrugated walls. Tools rattled in a tray when the Chinook throttled down. Medics moved first, weaving through bodies with quiet urgency, calling names, pointing to triage. The noise was a whole storm at once. Shouts, groans, blades winding down, the clank of stretcher wheels on concrete. Through it, she focused on her rifle. She pulled a cloth through the bore, slow and steady, like she always did. Reiner lay on a cot close by, pale but conscious, an IV dripping into his arm. He tried to prop himself up when he saw her, then thought better of it and relaxed again, watching her with a tired, lopsided grin. "You're supposed to look a little proud," he said, voice thin. "It helps morale." She checked the boldface, then the lugs. "Pride makes hands shake," she said. "Hands can't shake." He closed his eyes for a second and let out a breath that sounded like something heavy leaving him. "You saved them." Tessa didn't answer. She set the bolt down, lined up each small metal piece in a neat row, and wiped a smear of oil from the stock. Outside, boots hit the tarmac in sharp beats as SEAL Team Orion filed in. The survivors moved with the careful energy of people who knew they'd just outrun a door slamming shut. The first wave pushed past the hangar door, scanning for familiar faces. The younger operators were alert, almost skittish. The older ones carried that bone-deep fatigue you can't fake. Someone laughed, too loud at nothing. Someone else sat down in the middle of the floor and simply stared at his hands. The room smelled like dust, sweat, and cordite wearing off. Captain Foster hovered near the command table, radio under his arm. He had a folder open, already drafting the first lines of a report. His jaw worked like he was chewing on gravel. A few times he looked over at Tessa and then away, as if his eyes couldn't decide what to do with her. Then Commander Jacob Rains stepped through the door. He wasn't loud. He didn't have to be. The space just seemed to shift around him. Tall, lean, gray at the temples, uniform sun faded at the seams. He took off his gloves as he walked, tucking them into his belt, scanning the room with that habit of counting before speaking. He had the look of a man who knew what to say to a crowd and when to say nothing at all. His gaze passed over the triage line, over Foster, over Reiner on the cot. It landed on Tessa. Not on her face at first, on her wrist. The cuff of her sleeve had pulled back when she lifted the bolt. The faded black hawk feather lay there on her skin, a quiet shadow of ink. Rains slowed, stopped, and for a heartbeat, the din of the hangar seemed to fold in on itself. He took one step closer. Then another. The men around him noticed the shift and fell quiet in a ripple, like wind moving through wheat. "You," he said, and the word was almost a breath. He looked at the tattoo, then at her face. Something like disbelief moved behind his eyes. Disbelief mixed with recognition and the weight of years. "You were in Raven Company?" Conversations within earshot died. Someone near the door turned to look. Someone else straightened, eyes narrowing like he was trying to see more than what was there. Tessa didn't stand at attention or flinch. She set the bolt down gently on the cloth and met his eyes with calm that didn't ask for anything back. "Yes, sir." Rains took off his cap. He didn't seem to notice he was holding it. He studied her the way you study a photograph you thought you'd lost for good. "We heard Lockjaw didn't make it," he said, voice rough now. "You're the one who held the bridge that night." Words traveled fast in a room like that. People who had never met her knew the story by rumor only. A broken operation, a bridge no one could hold, radio traffic that cut out, and the kind of silence that hangs on a nation's conscience. Men shifted their weight and watched her, the lines on their faces going still. Even the medics paused. The helicopter outside finally shut down, and the last slice of rotor wash passed across the hangar like a sigh. Tessa set the rifle on its side and checked the safety out of habit. She didn't correct him first. She picked up her rag and wiped the tiniest ring of oil from the receiver, and only then said, evenly, "Didn't hold it. Just made sure others got out." It wasn't false modesty. It was the plain, unadorned accounting of someone who had measured cost in names, not numbers. The line landed in the room with a weight that felt heavier than the shot itself. A few men swallowed and looked down. Rains closed his eyes for a second, as if he could still hear old radio static. He opened them and took a step back, giving her space, but his voice carried. "We had Rangers on the far bank. We thought you were gone." He drew a slow breath, steadying himself. "I've told that story a dozen times and always ended it with a grave. Seems I've been wrong." Tessa's mouth almost softened into a smile, but it didn't get that far. "Graves get enough visitors," she said. "No need to send me early." Reiner let out a small laugh that turned into a wince. He raised his uninjured hand. "Can confirm she is not a ghost," he said, earning a few quiet smiles along the line of cots. Foster cleared his throat, stepped forward like he needed to reassert the rules, and then seemed to think better of it. He looked at Rains, then at Tessa, then down at the report he hadn't finished. Whatever speech he had prepared about chain of command lost its force in the face of the present tense. Living men, living woman, living debt. Mercer, the young SEAL who'd first noticed the patch, appeared at the edge of the group, eyes wide. "That bridge," he said under his breath to no one in particular. "My first instructor at Coronado told it like a legend. Said a Marine sniper covered the crossing till the last bird lifted, then never turned up on a roster again." He looked at Tessa like, "You look at a lighthouse you've only seen on maps. Didn't think I'd ever meet her." Rains's hand was still on his cap. He seemed to notice and lowered it to his side. He stood straight then, as if memory had put steel in his spine. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, using her name like it was an honorific by itself. "I'm Jacob Rains." We worked the same dirt in Ghazni. I didn't know I carried a thank you this long." She inclined her head a fraction. "You don't owe me one." "I disagree," he said quietly. The tent stayed hushed. Even men across the hangar who couldn't hear the words felt the current. You can sense when the ground shifts under your feet, when a story you thought you knew is rewritten in front of you. A medic stepped up to check Reiner's vitals and, for a moment, the spell loosened. Rains used that beat to look around the room, catching eyes. "For the record," he said, his tone turning crisp without rising in volume, "Overwatch Lockjaw took a shot today that saved my command team. That is not up for debate." Foster opened his mouth and then closed it. He nodded once, clipped and tight. Rains looked back at Tessa. The lines on his face deepened, not with strain now, but with respect that had memory behind it. "I have been to too many memorials," he said, softer. "I would rather stand here for this." Tessa glanced toward the open hangar door, where the light met the shadow on the floor. Outside, the sky was starting to shift into the flat gold of late afternoon. She felt all the eyes on her and none of them at once. Whatever this moment was, she didn't want it to turn into ceremony. The work wasn't over. It never was. She closed the case around the rifle with a quiet click. "Sir," she said, "there are still teams in the field that need routes cleared and comms sorted. I can be on a ridge in 30 minutes. Rains exhaled through his nose, something like a laugh hidden in it. "You were always a step ahead, weren't you?" He shook his head in a way that was almost affectionate. "We'll get you what you need." He turned to the nearest radio tech and gave a series of short, precise instructions. The tech moved. Officers moved. The hangar woke back up, but the tone had changed. Where there had been sharp edges, there was a softer, deeper current, like people had remembered what they were here to be to one another. As things shifted back toward routine, a few of the men who had joked earlier found reasons to pass near Tessa's bench. They didn't apologize. She didn't ask them to. One tightened a strap on a med pack. Another set a fresh water bottle near her elbow and walked on. In a place like this, those were the words people used when real words were too heavy. A strap pulled, a bottle left, a nod that didn't need explanation. Rain stayed for a beat longer. "One more thing," he said, voice low enough that only she and Reiner could hear it. "You said you didn't hold the bridge." "Maybe, but you held something that mattered just as much." Tessa paused, hands still on the latches of the case. "What's that?" "Time," he said. "Long enough for the rest of us to make it across." She looked at him for a long second, and the faintest hint of warmth touched her expression. "That's the job," she said. "Make a little time where there isn't any." He gave a single, solemn nod. Not a salute. Not yet. That would come later, when the story had reached the others, when the whole unit stood still together. For now, he put his cap back on and stepped away, already turning toward the next set of decisions. The room resumed its rhythm. Reiner's monitor beeped a slow, steady beat. The stain of dust on the concrete looked like a faded map. Somewhere outside the hangar, a generator coughed and settled. Tessa lifted the case, felt the familiar weight in her hand, and set it down again to double-check the latches. Habit, not doubt. Across the space, Mercer caught her eye and gave the smallest nod. It said more than a speech. She returned it in kind and reached for her notebook, flipping to a clean page. She wrote down the new wind pattern, the shift in temperature, the angle of light through the hangar door. Ordinary details that could save lives later. The moment had passed, but its shape stayed in the air. A name had stepped out of rumor and into the room. A quiet truth had stood up where noise had been. And for the people who were there to see it, the story sharpened into something they would carry for the rest of their days. The rifle lay silent. The hands that tended it moved with care, and the words she had spoken didn't hold it. Just made sure others got out. Hung like a low note, steady, honest, heavier than any round she'd ever sent downrange. The next morning, the hangar was spotless. Tables cleared, equipment stacked, the faint smell of coffee and gun oil drifting in the air. The noise of the night before, the chaos, the shouting, the pounding of helicopter blades, was gone. What remained was the heavy quiet of aftermath. The debrief had been called for 0800. Every seat was filled before the clock hit the mark. Rows of SEALs, Marines, and officers sat straight-backed, boots aligned. Even the airmen from the comms unit stood along the wall. No one spoke above a whisper. Tessa stood at the far end of the hangar beside her rifle case, uniform brushed but still dust-stained at the cuffs. The faint scar on her eyebrow caught the light. Her nameplate read Hayes, but everyone in that room already knew the other name, Lockjaw. Commander Rains entered with quiet authority, cap under his arm, expression carved in stone. Captain Foster followed him, eyes forward, jaw locked, his earlier frustration now replaced by a silent acknowledgement of facts he could no longer bend. Rains stopped at the center of the hangar floor and turned to face the assembled units. Attention on deck. Every man and woman in the room snapped to standing. The scrape of boots on concrete echoed like a single heartbeat. He let the silence hold for a few breaths before he spoke. His voice carried across the steel walls, calm but weighted. Yesterday, 220 of my SEALs were surrounded in the Helmand Valley. They should not be standing here today. But they are. He looked toward Tessa. Because of her. A murmur of boots shifting traveled through the ranks. No one dared break the stillness, but heads turned, eyes found her. Rains continued, Sergeant Tessa Hayes, Marine Scout Sniper. Some of you know her by another name. Raven Company. Ghazni. He paused, voice softening. Lockjaw. The word carried like an old prayer. Even the air felt charged. A few veterans in the back straightened instinctively, recognition flashing across faces that hadn't heard that call sign spoken aloud in years. Rains's voice hardened again, pride lacing through command. This Marine saved 220 of my SEALs yesterday, and years ago, she saved an entire company no one knew survived. She took a shot no one else dared, and she did it without hesitation. He stepped forward until he stood directly in front of her. For a moment, the formality fell away, replaced by the quiet humanity of one soldier looking another in the eye. His voice dropped. You've carried weight most people can't imagine. And you've done it without ever asking for recognition. That ends today. He brought his hand up to his brow in a deliberate, slow salute. The sound of his glove brushing against the brim of his cap was the only thing that broke the silence. Then another salute followed. And another. Within seconds, the entire hangar was standing in unison rows of SEALs and Marines, their boots locked, their right hands raised in perfect formation. No music, no speeches, no cameras, just the sound of air moving through the cavernous space and the collective breath of those who finally understood who stood among them. The moment stretched, still and heavy, filled with something words couldn't hold, respect, remorse, gratitude, and awe, all wound together. Tessa didn't move for a long while. Her chin lifted slightly, her hands rested at her sides. A faint tremor passed through her fingers, but her expression stayed composed, eyes steady, lips pressed, the calm of someone who had already seen too much to be undone by emotion. Rains held the salute a few seconds longer, then lowered his hand. The others followed, the motion precise, like a wave of acknowledgement rolling across the hangar. He said softly, You've done your job, Sergeant. More than any of us had a right to ask. She met his gaze, voice level but low. Just doing my job, sir. Her words landed quietly, but in the kind of way that fills every corner of a room. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reverent. A few SEALs who had mocked her before looked at their boots, shame flickering across their faces. One of them, Mercer, swallowed hard and whispered under his breath, Ma'am, thank you. It wasn't meant for anyone to hear, but it reached her just the same. Rains nodded once and turned to address the group again. If any of you ever doubt what leadership looks like, look at her. If you ever forget what courage sounds like, remember that single shot echoing through the valley. He dismissed the formation with a final command, his voice softer now, carry on. The men and women began to disperse slowly, some stopping to shake her hand, others giving quiet nods. A few simply met her eyes, saluted once more, and walked away without saying anything, because anything more would have felt small. Reiner, arm in a sling, hobbled over. "You know," he said, half grinning, "if you'd missed, I'd have to come back and haunt you." She smirked faintly. "Then it's good I don't miss." He laughed, coughed once, then stood beside her in silence as the last of the group filtered out. The camera of the mind lingers there on her face, the streak of dirt along her cheek, the faint line of dried blood just beneath her collar, the quiet depth in her blue-gray eyes. There's no glory, no arrogance, just that same steady calm that carried her through the chaos. Relief and sorrow share space there, twin reflections of what it costs to do the right thing. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint hum of rotor blades in the distance. The day went on, the war went on, but for one suspended moment, time itself had stopped in that hangar. And in that silence, deeper than any speech could reach, every soldier in that room understood that true heroism rarely announces itself. It just takes the shot, makes sure others get home, and keeps breathing. The night had finally gone quiet. The valley below was a vast stretch of shadow and faint movement, where hours ago chaos had burned like fire. Now, only the soft rise and fall of distant flares marked the horizon, brief flowers of light fading into the dark. Tessa sat alone on the ridgeline, knees drawn up, the rifle resting across them. Her gloves were off. Her fingers, steady all day, trembled now in the stillness. She rolled a small stone between them, grounding herself in the grit of the earth. Every sound, wind, sand, the faint buzz of static in the headset beside her felt sharper after so much noise. Below, the valley slept. Medics had pulled the last wounded out hours ago. The radio nets were calm. The sky had cleared, stars bright enough to sting. She tilted her head back, letting the cold brush her skin. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving only exhaustion. And yet, her mind replayed the shot. The timing, the wind call, the silence after, the moment between duty and defiance that had changed everything. Her hands found their rhythm again, cleaning her rifle in slow, practiced motions. Metal gleamed faintly in the starlight. The barrel was still warm, though the desert night was freezing. She brushed a thumb along the stock where a shallow scratch marked the wood, a keepsake of the day's fight. The radio beside her crackled just once. Then a voice, low and familiar, came through. "Commander Rains." "Lockjaw," he said, his tone softer than it had been in the hangar. "You brought them home." For a long second, she didn't move. Then, quietly, she smiled. Not the kind of smile meant for cameras or glory, but the kind that comes when the noise fades and the soul exhales. She reached over, thumbed the power switch, and the static fell silent. The desert wind carried the faint rustle of dust and the smell of gunpowder still clinging to the rocks. Her shoulders relaxed. The night, at last, felt wide enough to breathe in. She looked toward the valley again, where a few faint fires flickered at the perimeter of the base. Somewhere down there, Reiner was resting, medicated but alive. Somewhere down there, 220 men who should have died were laughing quietly, or calling home, or just sitting with the miracle of still being here. She didn't need to join them. It was enough to know they were breathing. The stars shifted as the night deepened. Her own reflection in the rifle's glass was faint and tired. She brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and whispered to no one, "Another day done." A coyote called somewhere in the distance, a lonely sound that echoed and then fell away. She picked up her rifle case, closed it, and laid it beside her pack. The narrator's voice drifts in like the wind, quiet, steady, the kind that feels more like thought than speech. Courage isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't wear medals or chase headlines. Sometimes, it sits in the dirt, breath steady, hands shaking only when no one's looking, waiting for a wind shift that could change everything. Sometimes courage is a heartbeat between orders and instinct. It's the whisper that says, "If I don't, they die." And sometimes, courage walks back into the dark, unseen, because doing what's right is its own reward. Tessa rose, slung her rifle case over her shoulder, and began the slow walk back to base. Each step left shallow prints in the sand, already filling in behind her as the wind carried on. No spotlight followed. No crowd waited. But the valley remembered. The men she saved would remember. And the quiet would too. True strength is silent precision, doing what's right, even when no one believes you can. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories, because every view, every share, and every comment helps keep the spirit of our heroes alive. Drop a salute in the comments for Sergeant Tessa Lockjaw Hayes, and let us know where you're watching from. These true moments of courage remind us that heroism doesn't always come with fanfare or noise. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's patient. And sometimes it whispers through a single perfect shot.